Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, it's always important to remember how the war in this region began. 424 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping some 250 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, on October 8th of last year, Iran essentially joined this war when it greenlighted its proxies from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and Yemen, all to launch direct attacks against Israel, including Iran proper. Now let's turn to central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Dr. Amnon Sofrin, formerly the head of the intelligence division at Mossad, as well as a senior officer at the IDF Intelligence Directorate. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you about the latest breaches that were reported yesterday and drew ultimately also a vigorous Israeli response to some Hezbollah violations to the ceasefire.
First of all, Hezbollah has to rebuild its capacity and, of course, its pride, and it's what we call its name within Lebanon and, of course, vis-a-vis Israel, because all the Arab world thinks that Hezbollah was badly defeated, and now it has to prove that it's not that. As a matter of fact, they are the reason that they claim that they launched this attack was because of the Israeli activity on South Lebanon. They are we're going on with, first of all, destroying more infrastructure of Hezbollah on the villages that are very close to the borderline between Israel and Lebanon. On the second hand, we're trying to deny any attempt of these people to get inside, to get back to their homes, even though Hezbollah is pushing them back to these villages. And the IDF, of course, is making all its efforts to deny them from getting back to their homes. Now, the fact that Hezbollah launched these two mortar shells on Mount Dov, what we call Mount Dov Ridge, is a symbol that they are not interested in a great escalation or large escalation, because they launched this rocket, these mortars, on what we call military positions, only because in Mount Dov you don't have any residents, only military positions. And this is an area that is on debate between Israel and Lebanon. They claim that this is part of their territory, and of course it's being captured by us on 1971. And therefore that was the symbol that they are not going to give up, and they are going to go on fighting, and they are still alive and kicking. And of course, Israel acted upon or reacted accordingly, not attacking Beirut, not attacking other infrastructure, but only targets within South Lebanon to contain the issue and to symbol that they are not going to give up. And any violation of the ceasefire is going to be responded immediately by brutal force.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to the United Kingdom, where we're joined by retired Colonel Richard Kemp, formerly the field commander of British forces in Afghanistan and head of the international terrorism team at the Joint Intelligence Committee at the British Cabinet Office. It's great to see you, Colonel. I'd like to hear your take on this. Naturally, we heard Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz during a tour of Northern Command earlier today, coming out and saying if the ceasefire collapses, if Lebanon fails to enforce the ceasefire as is outlined by the arrangement put forth by the United States and France, Israel will relaunch the war, and it will deepen its operational objectives to include also targeting the Lebanese government. What are we to take out of those remarks?
I think the reality is that Israel knows very well that the war is not over between itself and Hezbollah, and the ceasefire, it only really agreed to ceasefire, I think, not because it had any recognition that this was a satisfactory end of the conflict. It agreed to ceasefire in my understanding, because it was about to have a UN Security Council resolution adopted, which the US would not stop, which I think Biden was signaling he would not veto, which was to compulsorily bring about a ceasefire in Lebanon, which would have been much more problematic in the longer term for Israel. Although it could, of course, ignored that, it would have been in breach of a binding UN Security Council resolution, which it would not want to have to do. So, in effect, my understanding is that this ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is, in fact, is a bridge over the remainder of the Biden administration. And when President Trump enters the White House on the 20th of January, I think the Israeli expectation is that they will not be subject to a similar UN Security Council resolution. If there was one brought up, then the UN would veto it. This is their expectation, I think, and then after the 20th of January, the US will give Israel a much freer hand, whether it be in Lebanon, in Gaza, or indeed dealing with other Iranian proxies or with Iran itself, than they've had so far. We shouldn't forget, although the Biden administration has provided very, very significant support to Israel in the year that the war's been going on, it's also applied many constraints which have hampered Israel, including, but not restricted to, but including pretty significant restrictions on, or at least delays on, munition supplies for Israel, which is a major constraint when you consider Israel's fighting on 7 different battlefronts at the moment. So I think whether this ceasefire holds or doesn't hold, Israel, I believe, will want to be seen and will be seen as adhering to the agreements in the ceasefire. But if need be, as Israel Katz said, if need be, Israel will resume the conflict with great strength if Hezbollah carry out further significant breaches of it.
Indeed. Well, let's turn now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Dr. Mike Duran, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at Hudson Institute, formerly the Senior Director at the National Security Council in Washington for the Middle East and North Africa. It's great to see you, Mike. I'd like to immediately ask you also to elaborate on the situation in Lebanon. But beyond that, we heard just last night that President-elect Trump, has tapped Bulus, the father-in-law of his daughter, to be the next special advisor for the Middle East and Arab world, to include the Lebanese theater. He himself is Lebanese, Lebanese-American, born in Lebanon, ran at some point also to the Lebanese parliament, and is a close ally of the party of the former president Michel Aoun, which happens also to be, these days at least, an ally of the Iranian proxy Hezbollah. How are we to understand this decision, and to what degree is that going to impact his decision maker, that of President-elect Trump, with regard to Israel's freedom of operation to enforce a ceasefire in Lebanon particularly?
I agree with everything that we just heard from our colleagues, and particularly Colonel Kemp's explanation of the intention of the Netanyahu government to use this as a bridge, this ceasefire as a bridge to the next administration. All of the statements that we're hearing out of the Trump administration suggest that it is going to apply a very serious pressure campaign against Iran. You saw just yesterday, President Trump also issued a statement about the hostages in Gaza, saying that he was going to unleash holy hell on any hostage takers if the hostages are not released before he comes before his inauguration. What we don't know about the incoming Trump administration is what role will military pressure play in the pressure campaign against Iran, and in particular, what role will Israeli military pressure play? That has to be negotiated, but clearly that has to be negotiated between Jerusalem and Washington. clearly there is a strong expectation that that the Trump administration is going to look more favorably on efforts by the Israelis to degrade or destroy the Iranian nuclear program. And perhaps the Americans might even work together with the Israelis. We have to wait and see where that where that comes out. I don't think that any official, including the father-in-law, any individual official, including the father-in-law of Trump's daughter, is going to change those big lines of policy. And I don't know him personally, but from everything I hear, he's very loyal to Donald Trump and completely sympathetic to the efforts to weaken Hezbollah and to weaken Iran. So I'm expecting to see a shift from the Lebanese theater to the Iranian theater pretty quickly after the inauguration, or at least an attempt by the Israeli government to move to the Iranian theater. And I think that the value of this ceasefire will be, historically, we will evaluate the ceasefire as to whether it allowed a bridge to that new front against Iran or not. And I don't think any of the tit for tat that's going on now is really what's going to determine whether we think this was a success or a failure.
Mm-hmm. Well, General Sofrin, naturally, the Bulus family, Orthodox Christian family, is a well-respected family in Lebanon, and they have deep connections beyond Lebanon, also in other locations. But if you want to touch on that briefly, that could be helpful. But I'd like to shift gears also to the question on hostages. There was a meeting between the head of the Turkish intelligence agency MIT, namely Ibrahim Kalin, and the head of the Israeli security agency Shin Bet, namely Ronen Bar, during the course of which the chief focus was the matter of the hostages in light of the fact that the leadership of Hamas, after leaving Qatar, have moved many of them to Turkey, rendering basically Ankara a party to the whole discussion of a potential agreement with regard to the release of hostages.
There are probably negotiations beyond the scenes that are going between Israel, between Egypt, Qatar, and now Turkey has joined in some way to try to mediate as well, but they don't play what we call a very major role. The major role is being played by the Egyptians and the Qataris. Now, as I understand, Hamas feels that, first of all, is isolated, since that the fighting at the northern front is over, for the time being, of course, and there is a ceasefire. Iran is dealing with itself right now, is very focused with what are going to be the future under Trump administration and the promises on what we call maximum pressure and so on and so on and so on. And they're engaged with that, and their focus is not on Hamas, but only on what is going to become on Iran and how they are going to deal with that. This is, by the way, one of the facts that probably one of the reasons that Iran didn't respond on the attack that we carried out on October until now. They're just speaking and spreading rumors and promising that they're going to retaliate and so on and so on. But nevertheless, it didn't happen so far. And maybe they reconsider right now because of the fact that they know that Trump was elected to be president, that it has effect on many areas around the world, including on Iran. Mm-hmm. The second issue is what kind of compromise can be achieved within Gaza with the leadership of Hamas. As I understand what is going on beyond the scenes and some rumors that are being spread out, it's going to be a temporary ceasefire to release some of the hostages. First of all, the provision is, of course, that we know how many of them are still alive, to get what we call the bright picture and to be sure about the details as who is alive and who is unfortunately dead. And to release what we call a humanitarian phase the older men and the young ladies and the ladies at all ages, and only then to speak about the next phase. And they still consistently claim that this will be a provision of stopping the war, receiving international guarantees on that. And of course, Israel should leave the Gaza Strip totally and will not leave even one Israeli soldier will not be deployed in Gaza. Now, it looks like that something is going on and something is moving. There are too many rumors and too many signs of that. And I hope, for the sake of all of us, and of course the sake of the families and the people that are being abducted and held in Gaza, that it will be done as soon as possible.
Well, I hope that Israel does not succumb, of course, to a disengagement of sorts, and it will be able to put Hamas in its place and not pursue its delusional demands, as has been ongoing for too long. But Colonel Camp, if you'd like to have a brief point on the Gaza situation, since I'd like to shift gears to the Syrian arena, where we're seeing ongoing gains made by both Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the al-Qaeda affiliate, against the Assad regime, alongside the Free Syrian Army or National Army, whatever their name is today, with Turkish backing. It seems like there is a push being made to counterbalance that by the Iranians and the Russian air sorties being deployed in Syria. Nevertheless, it doesn't seem to dissuade the Sunni forces from pushing forward.
Yeah, I think very briefly on Gaza, the Hamas is obviously extremely concerned now, and that's the reason why they are thinking in more serious terms now about the possibility of a ceasefire. And some of their actions do show they're pretty desperate for it, because they recognize that a ceasefire, potentially with Israel withdrawal from Gaza, which I don't think even they can expect as a potential reality, because Israel's really got to stay in Gaza, come what may, from now on, in one form or another. But I think there's an indication of their dismay, because they've seen what's going on in the north, as well as to their own, the serious destruction of Hamas itself, but they're also seeing Hezbollah effectively collapsing in the north, not necessarily entirely military collapse, but a collapse which has led to the ceasefire. And they're seeing, of course, again, the weakening of Iran, through Hezbollah and through Israeli actions against Iran as well. Plus, you've got Trump about to enter the White House, and therefore I think they want to try and grasp whatever straw they can in the interim period. And the situation in Syria is due, in my opinion, entirely to the global perception, and certainly the perception in the Middle East, that Iran has been severely weakened. And I think the jihadists, with some of which at least have significant Turkish backing, the jihadists have seen an opportunity here to resume, effectively, to resume the actions of the rebellion in Syria, which have been pretty much paused for a while, because of Iranian weakness. And I think that prompted this latest surge. Of course, it has major implications, because what can Iran do now compared to what it could do before? I think Iran has been seen to be a paper tiger. Yes, it's making an attempt to do something. What can Russia do now compared to what it was able to do before? Russia is embroiled in a very, very costly war in Ukraine, which doesn't just cost a lot, but it also requires a lot of Russian forces. And indeed, some Russian forces were withdrawn from Syria shortly after the war in Ukraine began in order to use them in Ukraine. So Russia's pretty weak on the ground, and that puts Russia, I think, above all countries, into a very difficult strategic dilemma. Russia they want to hold on to their influence in Syria. Do they have the ability to do so? The Iranians, who are very good, a very close ally of Russia, and they're probably their number one or number two supplier of munitions during this war in Ukraine, the Iranians will want their Russian allies to take I think the weight of the protection of Assad in Syria. So and can Russia do that? This is a real big dilemma, I think, for Putin. If he doesn't have enough forces to deal with Syria effectively, can he pull anything out of Ukraine, where he's making significant progress now? Again, that's far from clear. But I think the real problem now, apart from for Assad, the real problem now lies on Putin's shoulders as far as the situation in Syria is concerned.
Indeed. Well, there was a very interesting report this morning about the fact that the Russians have been moving a lot of their naval assets from the port in Tartus out into the eastern Mediterranean shoreline in order to avoid a scenario that they do not foresee at this moment. Nevertheless, there are concerns which are indicating some stress within the higher echelons in Moscow. Dr. Duran?
I think it's interesting to look at all of this from the point of view of Ankara. In a way, at least one way to analyze this is to see this as a Turkish move to exploit the weakness of the Iranian system that Israel Israel brought about. The Russian-Iranian alliance is the key factor in Ukraine, and it's a key factor in Syria. And President Erdogan is positioning himself now so that he can become the main or a main interlocutor with President Trump about these two crucial and interlocked arenas simultaneously. We know that President Trump wants to try to get to some kind of ceasefire in Ukraine. The Turks have been strong supporters of Ukrainian claims against Russia. They can become a major guarantor of any kind of ceasefire in Ukraine. At the same time, they would like to have their interests in Syria respected. Those main interests that the Turks have are two. They want to prevent Syrian territory from becoming a base for PKK, that's Kurdish separatists, in Turkey. And they also want to return the Syrian refugees. There's some 5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and the Turks want to create conditions that will allow them to return to Syria. Of course, they are also tied to HTS and even more so to the Syrian National Army, the goal of which ultimately is to topple Assad. I think that third goal will take a back seat in Turkish priorities to the issue of the PKK and the return of the refugees. All of this bodes well for Israel because the Turkish interests, the near-term Turkish interests, are working against the Russians. They're putting severe pressure on the Russian-Iranian alliance. The key question is, how can the Israelis and the Trump administration play their hand so as to maximize the benefit? There's a number of ideas out there about this. Some of them I like better than others. The one I don't like the most is the idea that the UAE is pushing, apparently, of separating Russia from Iran in Syria. I don't think this is possible because Russia needs the Iranian Hezbollah and all of the militias of Iran as the foot soldiers in Syria. The Russians have, there's always been a kind of division of labor where the Russians provide the air power and the Iranians provide the ground troops. I think they're Siamese twins. You can't separate them. And any effort to separate them will just give them the ability to rebuild their forces in a relatively benign diplomatic context. I think we have to keep the pressure up on them.
In one sentence, what are we to focus on for the next couple of days? Dr. Sofrin, we'll start with you.
I think that we have to focus on, first of all, what happens in Syria. Does it endanger Israel? Does it pose any threat on the Golan Heights? Second, of course, on the Lebanese territory, to watch and see that Hezbollah maintains the ceasefire and stick to it, doesn't violate it on a daily basis, because this is going to be an exchange of what we call of fire on a daily basis, and this is not possible for us.
Thank you, General. Colonel Kemp?
Yeah, well, very much like the general, of course, we've got to focus on how the situation in Syria develops, in particular, what Russia does. And I do think that, Russia's actions are going to be pivotal in this current conflict. And, Russia, we may see in the long term potentially a closer relationship between Israel and Russia, both over what's going on in Syria and also in connection with Iran itself. And of course, Russia wants, as Mike Duran rightly said, Russia and Iran are a pair of Siamese twins in a way. But we've got to look and see how Iranian expectations of Russia actually develop. And then, of course, there is the situation, as the general said, in Lebanon. And how that develops will be important. And I think above all, we've got to listen to, perhaps over the coming days or weeks, listen to what President-elect Trump has to say about all this, because his opinions, his statements will, I think, have a major impact on what each one of these players decides to do in all of the different theaters.
Absolutely. Dr. Duran?
As far as what I want to watch in the next few days, I think it's vital that the Israelis maintain, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, freedom of action. This is something they negotiated with the Biden administration, that they have continued freedom of action. They're going to come under increased pressure from the French, from the Americans, from the Europeans, under increased pressure to restrict their actions in Lebanon and, of course, in Gaza as well. The only way they can maintain freedom of action is not by negotiating it, but by exercising it. And this is going to be the thing in the end that is going to determine whether they get security for their northern border or not. The freedom of action of them to take down Hezbollah forces. Nobody in the world, not the LAF, not the UNIFIL, not the French, not the British, not the Americans, is going to turn their guns on Hezbollah and make it comply with UN resolutions. The only force that can do that is the Israeli military.
Absolutely. Well, General Sofrin, Colonel Kemp, Dr. Duran, I appreciate you all very much, and thank you for your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom. TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio.